Welcome back, vintage camera lovers, and join me on an odyssey back to 2001 when Canon launched the PowerShot G2. This prosumer camera was essentially a 4-megapixel version of the original PowerShot G1 launched the previous year, which means you get full manual control, a bright lens, flip screen, hot shoe, and support for RAW files, although Canon did take the chance to make a few extra tweaks, including an improved grip. When it launched in 2001, the PowerShot G2 would set you back around $900 or £750, placing it roughly in the middle of the prosumer category at the time. These models were aimed at enthusiasts who wanted to step up in control and quality over cheaper models without the prohibitive costs of DSLRs at the time. For example, in 2001, Canon's EOS D30 cost around $3,000, so while enthusiasts may have desired its bigger sensor, SLR viewfinder and interchangeable lenses, the reality for most of us was a prosumer compact in the shopping trolley. Today, the PowerShot G series has enjoyed a surge in popularity with those looking for an old digicam that still represents a step up over basic models of the early 2000s. Models in the latter half of the G series can command prices of over several $100s or pounds, which I personally think is unjustified. But earlier models in the series could scratch that retro itch at a much lower price. In 2024, I bagged a pair of untested PowerShot G2s from eBay within a few weeks of each other for £15 and £21 respectively. Now it's always a risk, and I've gambled on several Gs that turned out to be unfixable, but both of my G2s came to life given a new battery, so it could be worth a punt. I actually reviewed the G2 back in 2001 as part of a prosumer group test in MacUser magazine, where I ranked it the overall winner. So let's see if it still impresses 23 years later as I take it out for a spin on the streets of Brighton. Physically, the G2 is clearly based on the same body as the earlier G1, with things like the viewfinder, flash, ports and lens, all occupying the same positions. But Canon's overhauled the exterior with a magnesium alloy front plate, that's cool to the touch, with more curves than the angular looking G1. Which you prefer is entirely personal of course, but most will agree the enlarged grip on the G2 does make it easier to hold. Admittedly not as much as other rivals at the time, but an improvement nonetheless. As before, the top surface is packed with controls and information to delight the enthusiast that it's aimed at. On the upper right side, you'll find the two-tiered main dial with an outer collar to power the camera into capture or playback modes. Within this is the smaller mode dial, identical to the G1 other than swapping its dedicated black and white position for colour effect that adds vivid, natural and sepia options along with black and white. Like the G1, there's program, aperture and shutter priority as well as full manual, although again there are some restrictions on aperture and shutter combinations due to both sharing the same iris mechanism. The exposure is adjusted using the joypad on the top right corner of the rear of the camera, which falls naturally under your thumb. In aperture and shutter priority, pushing left and right adjusts the settings, while in full manual mode the aperture is reassigned to up and down pushes. With the aperture wide open at f2 though, the G2's maximum shutter speed is limited to 500th of a second. Close it to f3.5 and you can increase the shutter to 640th of a second, while at f5 you can reach 800th, but for the fastest shutter of 1000th of a second, you'll need to close the aperture right down to f8. In practice you can kind of cheat the system a little by selecting a faster shutter before then opening the aperture back a little, but the final exposure may not behave as you expect, and the bottom line is you'll find it hard to deploy those large apertures under bright conditions. Meanwhile, the large shutter button is surrounded by a redesigned zoom collar that adjusts the focal length with a single speed, but at least the lurches between those increments isn't too bad. In the middle is a fully featured hot shoe, which lets you mount Canon Speedlight flash guns, making it ideal for event work. Canon quotes compatibility with the 220EX, 380EX, 420EX and 550EX, although the larger models do become a bit ungainly on the relatively small body. On the upper left side is an LCD information screen, which looks similar to the G1, packing a wealth of shooting detail at a glance, including exposure, quality, drive mode, shots remaining, battery life and white balance. You'll also see if the macro mode is enabled or not. As before, the rear is home to a wealth of buttons providing dedicated access to settings including spot metering, the macro mode, exposure lock, and another button which toggles between exposure compensation, white balance, exposure bracketing, and flash compensation. White balance has auto, 6 presets and a custom mode, while the menus now offer the option to switch between evaluative or center weighted metering, in addition to a direct spot metering button by the viewfinder. Below the joypad, the set button can now let you manually select between one of 3 AF areas, an upgrade over the G1, while the menus let you assign whether the spot metering is linked to them or just stays central. For those who prefer manual focusing, pushing the dedicated MF button on the left-hand side now displays a useful distance scale on screen, along with a magnified view in the centre. Like the G1, composition is with either a basic optical viewfinder or a flip screen, neither of which appear to have significantly changed. The viewfinder remains rudimentary, with the only markings being crosshairs to mark the centre. The screen remains a highlight though, not only delivering 100% coverage and an image that's viewable in bright light, but flipping and twisting to almost any position, allowing comfortable framing at high or low angles, as well as forward to face you or back on itself for protection. Behind the door on the grip side, you'll find a compact flash card slot, which can take both traditional Type 1 and thicker Type 2 cards, the latter including the IBM microdrive. Canon supplied the G2 with a 32MB card, which was quite generous in 2001, and many used samples actually come with this card, but if you're looking for a newer one, I can always recommend my trusty SanDisk Ultra 2 1GB card, which seems to work in every camera that takes CF memory. Behind the flap on the left side, you'll find 2 ports, digital output and a 9.5V DC input. The former delivers a USB output and the latter allows internal charging or mains power, but both are proprietary sockets, so will only work with Canon's supplied accessories, so don't lose them. Alongside the flap is a 3.5mm AV output for TV slideshows. Canon also supplies a handy infrared remote control which can adjust the zoom and fire the shutter or be used to operate a slideshow. It's a nice accessory to include. In fact, remote control is a big thing for the G2, which is also supplied with software that lets you control it over USB from a computer, including a live image. Now, tethered shooting is something that is normally reserved for higher-end DSLRs, so it's nice to have it here for studio photographers. The G2 is powered by the same BP511 lithium-ion pack as the G1, a battery that Canon used on many different cameras over a long period. As such, it's easy to get a replacement pack today in the likely event that the original has given up the ghost. The compartment remains under the camera with the tripod thread pretty uncomfortably positioned on the opposite side. That said, it does mean that you should be able to access the battery compartment when using smaller tripod plates. The battery itself is charged inside the camera using the supplied CA560AC adapter. This also provides the camera with a DC power source, but if you no longer have the adapter or a used model didn't come with it, there's a variety of BP511 external chargers available. The PowerShot G2 inherits the same lens as the G1, a 7-21mm f2.2.5 zoom, equivalent in coverage to 34-102mm, with a minimum focusing distance of 6cm. Now, while that does sound close, some rivals can focus even closer still. In fact, macro is one of the G2's weak points. Like the G1, it's branded as a Canon lens, although as before, I'm pretty sure it's an optical unit that's shared with several other popular models at the time, including the Sony S70 and Epson 3000Z. That said, Canon may have applied its own coatings to it. Now, there's no filter thread as standard, but the optional LA-DC58 adapter fits over the extending lens barrel and equips the camera with a 58mm thread. This also then lets you mount one of 3 optional and somewhat hefty lens adapters. The WC-DC58 multiplies the coverage by 0.8 times, widening the short end to an equivalent of 28mm. Meanwhile, the TC-DC58 multiplies it by 1.5 times, extending the reach to an equivalent of 153mm. And finally, the 250D close-up lens does just that, improving the fairly modest macro capabilities, but only by a little. Behind the lens is a 1/1.8-inch CCD sensor with 4 megapixels. This represents the headline upgrade over the G1 and is the same sensor employed by most prosumer compacts in 2001. It delivers a maximum resolution of 2272 by 1704 pixels, giving it a roughly 10% boost in detail over the G1 or other 3.3 megapixel models when measured horizontally or vertically. From the menus, you can choose 3 lower resolutions, as well as 3 levels of JPEG compression. Best quality superfine JPEGs at the full resolution typically measure between 1.3 and 2 megabytes each. Like the G1, you can alternatively shoot in the RAW format, albeit I believe now with an extended dynamic range, which I'll put to the test in just a moment. When set to RAW, there's no resolution or compression options. CRW RAW files measure around 2.7 megabytes each. The G2 shares the same ISO sensitivity options as the G1, starting at an impressively low 50 ISO, with higher 100, 200 and 400 ISO options available. An auto option is also offered, but only chooses between 50 and 100 ISO, so let's find out why. So here's a shot taken with the G2 at 50 ISO, which looks fine when viewing the whole image, but zooming in on a portion does begin to reveal a mild sprinkling of noise on flat textures and colours. At 100 ISO this becomes more apparent, while boosting it to 200 ISO shows noise becoming more obtrusive, and at 400 ISO, the maximum, it's really a step too far, unless you really need it to avoid camera shake under dim conditions. To be fair though, this is no different from other cameras sharing the same sensor, and at least Canon does offer a cleaner 50 ISO option that is lacking on many rivals. You could also adjust some of the image parameters from the menus, a feature that's pretty standard today, but pretty unusual back then. As for the lens, the bright aperture should allow you to stick towards the lower end of the ISO range for the best quality, but don't expect a bokeh monster. The restricted shutter and aperture combinations mean that you're rarely going to be able to use those larger apertures in bright daylight. The G2 can also film video clips at either 160 by 120 pixels for 2 minutes, or 320 by 240 pixels for 30 seconds, both at a maximum frame rate of 15 frames per second, albeit with no control over the exposure or indeed the zoom once you start filming. Video clips are at least stored with sound though. Right, now it's time to fast forward 23 years after the G2 was launched to see how it performs in the present day. Like many Canon cameras of this era, it's fairly easy to find replacement BP511 battery packs and compatible compact flash cards, see links in description. You're also not tied to those proprietary cables either, as external BP511 chargers means you don't need the original AC adapter, while a wealth of USB card readers means you won't need the data cable either, unless of course you fancy trying out that tethering software on an age-appropriate computer of course. Even the RAW files can be read by recent software. Here's a file from the G2 opened in the latest version of Adobe Camera Raw, where adjusting the shadows and highlight sliders to their extremes really is recovering tonal detail that was previously hidden in the image. Unlike many video formats back then, the AVI movie files are also played back fine in QuickTime on my current Mac, and could also be edited directly within Final Cut without converting them first. So all in all, it's a very practical vintage camera to use today. So, without further ado, it's time for my traditional slideshow of new images taken with an old camera. I'll see you in a minute.
You can also film 320 by 240 pixel video, and with the screen facing forward, you can even have a go at vlogging. Let's check out some more clips.
When I reviewed the PowerShot G2 back in 2001, it stood out in its prosumer peer group with a winning combination of features and quality. Sure, before long it was outgunned by models like Sony's f707 and Nikon's Coolpix 5000, but those early 5-megapixel rivals came in at a substantially higher cost. For most enthusiasts in 2001, the PowerShot G2 simply did everything that they wanted. It inherited the bright lens, manual control, RAW files, hot shoe, and flip-out screen of the original G1, but addressed some of its issues, adding selectable focus areas, evaluative metering, and colour effects, while reducing coloured fringing, and of course upgrading to the latest sensor. And while an extra megapixel doesn't sound like a great deal, in practice the 4-megapixel sensor of the G2 delivered better looking images overall than the G1, at least in my recent tests. Now today I'm not personally fond of the curvier shape and the champagne finish, but there's no denying the quality and feature set is compelling for the typical used prices. Now, as most of you know, Canon released a new PowerShot G model almost every subsequent year, initially boosting the resolution and the lens zoom range, but later removing key features like RAW and the flip screen. This rightly caused an outrage with reviewers and passionate G owners alike. Imagine pre-YouTube outrage, forcing Canon to reinstate them on future models before splitting the line in 2012 with the new G1X sporting a larger sensor. Then in 2014, the standard G series switched to the 1-inch type sensor, with the most recent models being the G7X3 and G5X2, both launched back in 2019. They're almost retro models today. The current popularity of digital compact cameras, the appeal of vintage, and lack of any new models has resulted in later PowerShot G models commanding what I think are pretty ridiculous prices on the used market, often hundreds of pounds or dollars for something like a PowerShot G16. I'd say don't encourage these prices and instead aim towards the earlier models like the PowerShot G2, which I bagged for less than £25 in working order. It'll scratch your itch for a vintage digital experience, delivering surprisingly good looking photos, seriously retro looking video, and crucially remains easy to connect and power up today. So, as always in the comments, I'd love to hear about your early digital camera experiences, whether you were part of the PowerShot G series or indeed any other brand. And if you do enjoy these videos that I make, the best way to encourage me to make more of them is to subscribe with notifications, of course, and then just try and watch as many of my other videos on this channel as you dare. Right, I'll let you get on with that. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.